Welcome to VSOW. Today we are attempting a deep dive into, well, arguably the very foundation of human anxiety, this search for meaning in a universe that just stubbornly refuses to provide clear answers.
That's right. Our mission here is to really get into some foundational texts concerning the meaning of life, or perhaps the lack thereof. We're focusing on philosophical responses to futility, to repetition.
Yeah, dissecting that core tension, between our deep human desire for clarity, for things to make sense, and the universe's, its resolute silence.
Exactly. And our sources today are quite powerful. We'll be starting with the foundational existential analysis of Albert Camus, especially the myth of Sisyphus. That text really gives us the vocabulary for understanding the absurd.
And we're putting Camus in dialogue with a much older text, Ecclesiastes, looking at its study on repetition and vanity, contrasting these two models of time, eternal return and something subtly different, eternal withering.
We'll also draw in some complementary thoughts, reflections on philosophical practice, the kind of tricky paradox of suffering, and even looking at why we seem to repeat historical mistakes.
But the guiding question, the one Camus insists is the only truly serious philosophical problem, is simple, stark even. Is life worth living?
It really is the ultimate question, isn't it? He argues it precedes everything else. Whether the world has four dimensions, five logical categories, those are secondary games. The immediate, urgent question is existence or oblivion. Choose life or choose not to live.
Okay, let's unpack this core idea then, starting with Camus's specific definition of the absurd. Because people use that word casually, right, to mean silly or just pointless. But Camus is very precise. It seems tied fundamentally to God's absence.
That's the crucial starting point. For Camus, the absurd isn't just in the world itself, nor is it purely in the human mind. It's born from the gap. The source material really emphasizes this. The absence of God, or at least a guaranteed transcendent meaning, creates this sharp conflict between what we crave, reason, coherence, happiness that lasts.
Things making sense.
Exactly. And what the world actually gives us, which includes arbitrary suffering and the absolute certainty of death.
So it's the friction point.
Yeah.
A moment our human need slams against that wall of cosmic indifference.
Precisely. Camus puts it beautifully. It's born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. The world is, in its essence, irrational. It just doesn't offer a satisfying why or what for to our deepest questions.
And this futility isn't just abstract. He shows it through raw, arbitrary pain. I'm thinking of his own writing, like The Death of the Child and the Plague. That feels like a perfect example.
It's a powerful one. Completely unearned, unexplained, totally disconnected from any moral logic we try to impose. It just happens. And that epitomizes the kind of absurdity that human reason just can't process or accept as reasonable.
And the weight of that conflict, that confrontation, is why Camus says judging whether life is worth living is the fundamental question of philosophy. Everything else is secondary.
Right. He points out that all other intellectual pursuits are, in a way, games we play afterwards. He even mentions Galileo facing death. He quickly recanted his scientific truth. Was that truth worth dying for? Clearly not for him at that moment. But people do die for their illusions, don't they? The illusions that convince them life has a profound reason.
Which brings us to the ultimate act he considers, suicide. It's obviously final, but for Camus, it's also a kind of confession. What's the psychology he sees there?
Well, he observes it's rarely committed because someone just, thought it through philosophically. It's more often prepared in the silence of the heart, a bit like how a great artwork develops unconsciously.
Huh. So the person might not even be aware they're heading that way.
Often not until the very end. It's an instinctive, often non-rational recognition that something has failed. It's a confession, as you said, that life is not worth the trouble.
It's recognizing the ridiculous character of habit, just getting up, working, eating, sleeping, repeat, and the shocking absence of any profound reason for living. Once you see that, the usual supports fall away.
Yes, and when those supports vanish, the individual is hit by this feeling of absurdity. Camus describes it as the divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting. It's like the familiar scenery of your life suddenly collapses.
And you feel like an alien, a stranger.
Exactly. An exile with no remedy. Because there's no memory of a lost home to return to and no hope of a promised land ahead, nowhere to go back to, nowhere to really arrive.
Where does this feeling, this awakening to being a stranger, typically begin? Does he pinpoint a moment?
He suggests it often starts when the chain of daily gestures is broken. We're usually just moving through life on autopilot, right? Governed by habit. Rising, office, meal, sleep,
The routine.
the routine. But then the simple question, why, pops up. Why am I doing this? And that weariness, that sudden halt in the mechanical process, it inaugurates the impulse of consciousness. It's not just being tired, it's the start of thinking.
It sounds like the world's shifting from just background noise to this, I don't know, foreground performance, but one without a script.
That's a great way to put it. The feeling itself is elusive, he says. It can hit you anywhere. He gives that example of seeing a man talking animatedly on the phone behind glass.
Right, you can't hear him.
You just see this frantic, incomprehensible mime show, and for a second he seems utterly alien. You think, why is he alive? Or that chilling moment looking at an old photo of yourself, seeing a familiar and yet alarming brother. We realize we contain something inhuman, even to ourselves. We are strangers to ourselves.
And the ultimate stranger, surely, is death. And time is the vehicle carrying us there. We're always living on the future, aren't we? Tomorrow I'll start this, later I'll do that.
We use the future to dodge the present. But Camus points out there comes a time when you can't keep doing that. You have to claim your age, place yourself on that curve. You know you have to travel to its end.
And that realization turns time into the worst enemy. We were carried by it, now we have to carry it towards the inevitable conclusion.
And the horror of death, he says, comes from its cold, mathematical aspect. It's just a final endpoint. And it's astonishing, he notes, that everyone lives as if no one knew about it. We operate in this sort of pervasive bad faith, acting like the end is always for someone else or far off.
Which means there's no real experience of death prepared for.
Right. When the body finally stops, the soul disappears, as he puts it. This definitive final nature of the whole adventure, that's what constitutes the core absurd feeling.
Okay, so the diagnosis is this clash between our mind's desperate longing for unity and the world's irrational silence. How does our intellect try to grapple with this? What's the mind's natural move?
Well, the mind's deepest desire is incredibly ambitious. It wants to unify everything, reduce the world to human terms, make it fit our understanding. It's this fundamental appetite for clarity, a deep nostalgia for unity. We crave that single principle that makes it all make sense, turns the cosmos into a neat, organized home for us.
But he's running into walls, right?
Yeah.
Paradoxes it just can't solve, no matter how clever it gets.
Exactly. That's the intellectual trap. Reason ends up contradicting itself. The sources mention classic examples like Aristotle's point about asserting ultimate truth. If you say everything is true, well, you've just asserted the truth of the opposite statement, nothing is true, which undermines your first claim. These kinds of paradoxes seem baked in.
And even science, which seems like our best tool for explaining everything, ultimately hits a similar wall. It starts with wonder, but ends in the metaphor.
That's Camus's critique. Science, seeking that single explanatory principle, might reduce the rich, complex universe down to the atom, then the atom to the electron. But then, to explain the electron, we're left with an image, an analogy, this invisible planetary system. It becomes poetry, a metaphor.
So the intellect is kind of stuck. Science offers either descriptions that are certain but don't really teach us anything fundamental about meaning, or it offers hypotheses that claim to teach us something profound but remain uncertain.
Precisely. We're left feeling like a stranger to myself and to the world, armed only with this thinking process that negates itself whenever it tries to claim ultimate meaning. The intellect, in the end, just confirms the absurd situation.
So when the mind hits this limit, this dead end, what happens? Some thinkers, faced with this existential pressure, look for an escape hatch.
Yes, and this is where Camus identifies a real danger zone. He calls it philosophical suicide. It's a deliberate flight from lucidity, from staring the absurd in the face.
So philosophical suicide isn't literal suicide, but it's for thinkers who start by honestly recognizing the absurd, the failure of reason, but then they leap to some kind of unifying principle or transcendence to make themselves feel better.
Exactly. It's an escape because it effectively destroys one half of the equation. The absurd is the tension, the opposition, the divorce between us and the world. The philosophical suicide eliminates that divorce by inventing some higher reconciliation, usually in the transcendent.
And Camus is quite critical of certain existentialists here.
Very. Thinkers like Jaspers, Chestov, Kierkegaard, they often begin by powerfully describing human limits, the breakdown of rational order, the feeling of impotence.
But how do they make the leap? Can you give an example of turning that failure into a kind of perverse triumph?
Well, take Jaspers. He starts from the impossibility of truly knowing the world empirically, the failure of reason to give us certainty. He feels powerless. But then he suddenly declares that this very failure reveals not the absence, but the existence of transcendence.
Ah, so because the world resists my reason so strongly, there must be something beyond reason it's pointing to.
That's the leap. Making the inability to understand into the very principle that illuminates everything. It's a clever way to find comfort, isn't it? If I fail, it's not because the target is illusory, but because I was aiming too low, the real target is higher up.
I see. And Chestov does something similar.
Chestov finds existence fundamentally absurd, irrational, contradictory. And then he says, essentially, that's God. We must rely on him precisely because he doesn't fit our rational boxes. He embraces the contradiction. The more irrational God seems, the more powerful he must be, capable of shattering the world's dreary certainties. But for Camus, this just gives up the crucial opposition.
And Kierkegaard is maybe the most famous example. He really leans into the contradictions, rejects worldly comforts, but finds his solace in faith.
Yes, his path is the sacrifice of the intellect. He makes the absurd nature of faith, its logical contradictions, the very criterion of the other world. His triumph, as Camus sees it, is found in his failure. He's trying to be cured of the burden of rational thought.
Whereas the absurd man, Camus insists, doesn't want a cure.
No, the absurd man wants to live consciously with the ailment, with the tension. By making the absurd a stepping stone to God, Kierkegaard abandons the core metaphysical state of the conscious, lucid human facing a silent universe.
What about the phenomenologists, like Husserl? They seem more focused on just describing experience, not leaping to God. Does Camus see them falling into a similar trap?
He examines Husserl quite closely. Initially, Husserl's method looks promising. It focuses on describing phenomena carefully, affirming particular truths revealed in experience, not chasing one big truth. It's about how we perceive things.
Okay, sounds consistent so far. Where's the leap?
The leap comes, Camus argues, when Husserl starts talking about extratemporal essences and eternal reason. He moves from describing how we see, say, a tree, to asserting that there's an eternal, unchanging treeness that exists outside of time, even if all actual trees vanished. He posits these eternal essences and immutable laws underlying reality.
Ah, so he subtly restores comfort by making the world fundamentally rational and orderly again, underneath the surface chaos. There are eternal rules, after all.
Precisely. He might start with careful description, but he ends up leaping to a kind of eternal reason, bringing back the very clarity and consolation that Camus believes the absurd condition forces us to reject.
So the bottom line for the absurd person is, don't flinch. Don't take the escape route.
That's the call for integrity. Maintain the tension. Live with the unyielding evidence of a life without consolation. Stay on that dizzying crest right before the leap, even though it's difficult and demands constant, painful awareness.
Okay, let's pivot now. We're moving from Camus's focus on the individual's conscious crisis to a broader, almost cosmological sense of futility we find in ancient texts. Specifically, that powerful line from Ecclesiastes, "There is nothing new under the sun."
Yes, this is a crucial shift because it forces us to consider futility not just as an internal feeling, but potentially as a structural feature of time itself. And the key concept here is Hebel, often translated as vanity.
Tell us more about Hebel, because vanity in English sounds a bit weak, maybe related to pride, for such a profound text.
That's a good point. The original Hebrew Hebel literally means something like vapor, breath, or just air. Think the puff of air from your mouth on a cold day, it's there, then it's gone.
Ephemeral?
Exactly. Fleeting, insubstantial. Metaphorically, it refers to things that have no lasting impact or real consequence. And Kohelet, the preacher in Ecclesiastes, argues this condition stems directly from our human limits. We're temporary, we can't control destiny, we can't predict the future, we can't grasp everything that happens. Our efforts are like writing on mist.
And that core principle in Ecclesiastes, what has been is what will be, is key here. The study we looked at argues that if you take this literally not just as Kohelet being depressed, but as a statement about how time actually works, it provides the logical structure needed to justify the claim that all is Hebel.
That's the fascinating move. Interpreting that principle literally reveals two distinct models of time. They seem similar, but the difference between them has huge implications for how you should live.
Okay, the first one is pretty famous. Eternal return. The everything repeats model. We associate this with Nietzsche, the Stoics.
Right. This model says everything that has happened will happen again, exactly the same way, and everything that will happen has already happened. Time is a perfect closed loop. Every joy, every sorrow, every tiny detail, it all comes back identically. Any end is just temporary, signaling the start of the same cycle again.
Okay, so that's total repetition. What's the second model?
And the second model, which the analysis suggests might actually fit Kohelet's overall argument better, is called eternal withering. Think of this as the past limits the future model. It still says that if something is going to happen in the future, it must have already happened in the past. Nothing truly new can emerge.
But. There must be a but.
But, and this is the crucial difference, it does not require that everything from the past repeats. Some things might just wither away, fade out of the cycle.
Okay, let me see if I've got this. Eternal return. 100% guaranteed exact repetition of everything. Eternal withering. The future can only draw from the past's repertoire, but it doesn't have to play every single tune again. Some past events might never recur.
You've got it. And this distinction becomes incredibly important when we look at Kohelet's rather stark view on existence. He has this hierarchy. The best state is to have never been born, second best is to be dead, and last is to be alive and suffering.
Right. If eternal return holds, then death isn't really an escape, is it? It's just a pause before you're forced back into the exact same suffering cycle. That doesn't seem to fit well with better off dead.
Precisely. But eternal withering does allow for a genuine end. It permits events, even entire lifetimes, to truly fail to recur. They can wither out of the cycle. This offers a possibility of actual escape from suffering, which makes sense of Kohelet saying, better is the end of a thing than its beginning. An end allows for a real return to dust.
That potentially solves a big puzzle in Ecclesiastes, doesn't it? How Kohelet goes from this deep despair, all his vanity and chasing after wind, to actually recommending practical things, like enjoying your work and not being anxious. If everything is pointless vapor, why bother enjoying anything?
This is where eternal withering shows its motivational edge, through something the analysis calls worst-case avoidance. Let's think about it. If you're living under eternal return, you know exactly what's coming back. The good bits and the bad bits, precisely repeated. You might try to live well, but the script is fixed.
But under eternal withering, that certainty is gone. You hit what the paper calls an epistemological barrier. You know the future is built from past events, but you don't know which specific subset will repeat.
And that uncertainty becomes a powerful driver for ethical concern. Imagine knowing you might be doomed to relive parts of your current life over and over, but you have no idea which parts, the good days, the bad days, the regrets.
You want to make sure every part was as good as possible, just in case that was the part that got stuck on repeat.
Exactly. You'd take even more care. You can't just relax thinking, oh, well, the good times will come around again, because maybe they won't. Maybe only the miserable Tuesday repeats forever. The possibility of the good stuff withering away, failing to recur, forces you to value and cultivate it now.
Wow. That's counterintuitive but powerful. The threat of non-recurrence, the chance that things could fall apart and stay apart, actually motivates intense positive action in the present.
And there's another advantage. Eternal withering allows for what the source calls the ideal outcome, something eternal return forbids. Since repetition isn't mandated to be perfectly identical, an agent can strive for a future cycle that contains only the good stuff. Maybe your first life cycle was 50-50 good and bad events. Eternal withering allows the possibility that a future recurrence might be, say, 30 good events and 0 bad ones. It allows for improvement, purification over time.
So paradoxically, the model that sounds more negative withering actually creates more space for optimistic effort because it allows for genuine positive change within the repetitive structure. The futility isn't absolute. It's conditional, responsive to your actions now.
Okay, let's bring it back to Camus. We've seen the diagnosis, the absurd confrontation, and the rejection of the tempting leap into philosophical suicide. So how should the lucid individual, the one who accepts the absurd, actually live? What's the positive program?
The mission, as the source puts it, is to turn that invitation to death, which absurdity presents, into a rule for life by just persisting in that clear-sightedness.
Exactly. And Camus outlines 3 key consequences, 3 pillars of the absurd life. The first is revolt. That sounds quite active, quite strong.
It does. What does he mean by revolt here? Is it political?
Not necessarily political in the usual sense. It's more fundamental. It's a constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity. It's sustained moment by consciousness. by refusing to resign yourself to the irrationality. It's not aspiration, though very important. It's devoid of hope for ultimate victory or a final resolution.
So it's just defiance.
Persistent defiance. It challenges the world's silence and irrationality anew every single second. It's what gives life its value, its majesty, he says, and it demands that one die unreconciled. No peaceful acceptance at the end.
Okay, so revolt is the first pillar. The second is freedom. But how can you be free if you're condemned to death and living in an absurd universe? That sounds like the opposite of freedom.
Well, Camus argues the absurd cancels out the traditional idea of eternal freedom linked to a divine plan or a meaningful destiny. But by stripping away that illusion of a purposeful future, it actually magnifies our freedom of action right here, right now, in the present.
How so?
By losing hope for eternity, for some ultimate reward or judgment, the absurd person is released from the demands of purpose. You're no longer obligated to shape your life according to some future goal or societal blueprint.
So you're freed from having to act like the responsible parent, the ambitious professional, the good citizen in order to achieve some future state or fulfill some prescribed role.
Exactly. You're liberated from those conventional chains of liberty, as Camus might put it. You become completely available to the present moment. He sees living for a future goal as creating barriers that confine life. The absurd man feels released from all that, free to focus with passionate attention on what is happening now. It gives him, Camus says, the divine availability of the condemned man. Just before execution, everything suddenly matters intensely because it's all there is.
Which leads directly to the third consequence, passion and quantity. If there's no ultimate scale of value, no eternal judgment, how do you choose what to do? How do you prioritize?
If all experiences are ultimately equivalent when measured against eternity, meaning they all end in nothingness, then the guiding principle shifts. It's no longer about seeking the best living according to some moral or qualitative scale, but about seeking the most living. Quantity replaces quality.
So you discard value judgments. This experience is inherently better than that one in favor of factual judgments about intensity, duration, multiplicity.
That's the idea. The goal becomes to be conscious of one's life, one's revolt, one's freedom, and to the maximum. It's about maximizing the awareness and intensity of the experiences you have, whatever they might be.
So the quantity isn't just about cramming more events in.
No, it depends primarily on the consciousness you bring to your life. Living more doesn't depend on external circumstances so much as internal awareness, fully inhabiting each moment. The only real obstacle to achieving this most living is, tragically, premature death, because it cuts short the potential quantity of conscious revolt.
And this whole philosophy of revolt, freedom, quantity, finds its perfect symbol in the myth of Sisyphus. Condemned by the gods to endlessly push a rock up a mountain, only for it to roll back down each time. Futile, hopeless labor.
He is the ultimate absurd hero, but his torture is only tragic, Camus insists, at the moments when he is conscious of it. Think about the modern worker doing repetitive, seemingly futile tasks on an assembly line. Their fate is only tragic during those rare moments when consciousness breaks through the habit when the why arises.
And Sisyphus' moment of consciousness, his pause for reflection, is when he's walking back down the mountain, right? The rock is rolled down, the physical labor is momentarily over, and he descends, fully aware of the fate waiting for him at the bottom.
Yes, and in that moment of descent, that pause, Camus says, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. Why? Because he knows his fate, he sees it clearly, that lucidity, that awareness is his victory.
He negates the gods who impose the punishment, and he keeps raising rocks. He owns his struggle.
He concludes that all is well, precisely because he has made his fate a human matter, settled among humans. He accepts it without appeal. The struggle itself, the effort in the face of known futility, that is enough to fill a man's heart.
His fate belongs to him. He's convinced of the purely human origin of everything human. And the final stunning line, one must imagine Sisyphus happy.
So we've explored these huge philosophical frameworks for dealing with futility, but we need to connect them back to the ground, to the reality of human suffering and how we actually practice wisdom day to day. Which brings us to the paradox of suffering, as thinkers like Ram Dass describe it.
Yeah, Ram Dass presents this really interesting duality about suffering. On a personal internal level, he suggests suffering can actually be seen as grace. How does that work?
Well, the idea is that your personal suffering, your mental anguish, your emotional pain points directly to where your mind is clinging, where it's attached. If I'm suffering because I'm getting old or because I lost something I loved, it's because my mind is holding on to a model of reality that resists what is. a model that demands permanence, youth, or painless existence.
So the suffering isn't the external event or even the physical pain itself, but my mind's resistance to it.
That's the core idea. When you're genuinely seeking freedom from these attachments, you start to see this internal resistance, the suffering, as grace. It's like a diagnostic tool. It shows you exactly where the ego is stuck, where you need to practice letting go. It becomes a teacher.
But the sources are really clear. This perspective is strictly for internal application. You can't just go around telling other people their suffering is grace.
Absolutely not. Ram Dass emphasizes this strongly. You have zero moral right to project that onto someone else who is in real agony. When we encounter the suffering of others, he says, it becomes our suffering too, through empathy. And it demands an immediate, intuitive, compassionate response to relieve it.
And crucially, the help has to be offered in the way the other person understands their own suffering. You give food to the hungry person because they define their need as hunger. But you wouldn't force food on someone who is fasting for spiritual reasons because they define their temporary suffering differently.
It captures that essential paradox of being human, doesn't it? We are one, suffering connects us all, but we are also separate individuals, and we have to respect each other's interpretation and chosen path through that suffering. As the Source puts it, suffering stinks and suffering is grace. Both are true simultaneously, depending on the perspective.
This need for conscious practice, for actively working with our minds, links directly back to ancient wisdom traditions, like the Stoics and Epicureans. Their philosophies weren't just theories. They were practices aimed at a kind of conversion, right? A real shift in one's way of being.
Definitely. These weren't just academic debates. They were life systems involving daily exercises, mental drills. Think about the Stoic practice of meditating on mortality each morning. What if today is my last day?
That sounds morbid, but the point isn't fear.
No, the point is the opposite. It's to cut through trivial anxieties and inspire immediate engagement with what truly matters. It fosters a kind of detachment from petty worries and encourages you to live fully now. It's a practical application of the absurd man's freedom, really.
Facing the certainty of death to maximize the conscious present. And someone like Epictetus, the former slave turned Stoic teacher, really embodied mastering that inner response.
His core teaching is so practical, so powerful. We can't control external events. The rock will roll down the hill, insults will come, losses will happen. But we can control our inner response, our judgment of those events. Reframing challenges not as catastrophes, but as opportunities to practice virtue, to grow stronger. That's the heart of Stoic practice. If someone insults you, that's their action. How you react internally, whether you feel insulted, that's within your control.
Okay, so we have these potent tools for individual transformation, for dealing with suffering and absurdity. Why then do we seem so bad at learning collectively? Why do societies, nations, keep repeating history's mistakes? The sources suggest a specific culprit, a failure of language.
It's a fascinating argument that our collective memory, our ability to learn from the past, is fundamentally undermined because we fail to define and use crucial words wisely. We end up talking past each other, using the same words to mean radically different things, often to justify incompatible desires or actions.
And the prime example given is Abraham Lincoln's insight about the word liberty.
Yes, Lincoln pointed out, the world has never had a good definition of liberty. Everyone declares they're for liberty, but they don't mean the same thing. This linguistic confusion allows deep moral errors to persist and repeat.
He used that powerful analogy of the sheep, the wolf, and the shepherd.
Exactly. The shepherd drives the wolf away from the sheep's throat. The sheep sees the shepherd as a liberator, restoring its liberty. But the wolf denounces the shepherd as a tyrant, a destroyer of liberty, because its freedom to eat the sheep has been taken away.
So the same word liberty means two not only different but incompatible things.
Precisely. And the source argues this same dynamic plays out constantly today. Words like freedom, rights, even compromise get used by opposing groups to rationalize fundamentally conflicting goals. This prevents genuine learning from past moral failures because we can't even agree on the terms of the debate.
So we're condemned to repeat history, maybe not because we're inherently foolish, but because we're linguistically careless, perhaps even deliberately dishonest with our definitions.
It suggests the crisis of the absurd individual facing a silent universe, the crisis of dealing with potentially endless repetition, and the crisis of societies failing to learn they might all stem from a similar root. A failure of lucidity, a lack of integrity in confronting reality as it is, including the reality of the words we use. #tagoutro.
Well, this deep dive has certainly covered a lot of ground. From the intense personal crisis of Cames's conscious individual to the, frankly, terrifying structures of time proposed in Ecclesiastes. It seems the core takeaway, running through all of it, is that while the universe might remain silent, our response has to be one of conscious, maybe even defiant choice.
I think that's right. Whether you're facing Camus's stark confrontation with that unreasonable silence or Kohelet's recognition of endless, perhaps withering repetition, the path to an authentic life seems to demand integrity. It means, as Camus put it, maintaining lucid reason, noting its limits, pursuing the quantity, the fullness of experience, and persisting in that revolt without collapsing into easy answers, whether philosophical or literal suicide.
And we've seen how, paradoxically, that very awareness of futility, of the absurd, can be the thing that energizes us. It becomes, in Camus' words, the wine of the absurd and the bread of indifference that fuels human greatness. So I want to leave you, our listeners, with a final provocative thought, drawing together those two models of time we discussed.
A challenging synthesis.
Think about eternal return, where every single moment, good and bad, is guaranteed to repeat exactly forever. Then think about eternal withering, where the future only draws from the past, but some things, maybe the best things, maybe the worst, might fade out, and you don't know which parts will get stuck on repeat. If you had to choose right now which model governs your life, the guarantee of the whole cycle or the uncertainty of the withering subset, how would knowing that, or not knowing it, immediately force you to reshape your actions, your choices today, and why?
It's a question worth sitting with, observing what demands that choice places on your present awareness.
If you found this deep dive into these fundamental questions of existence valuable, please do subscribe, like, and comment to share your own insights or questions. Your feedback really does help us decide where to point our philosophical compass next.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.